Wildlife Management from the University of Minnesota, 1976, and an MS in Wildlife Ecology from the University of Florida. After finishing her master's research, master's research, which was on deer and pine plantations. She worked for the Florida Game and Freshwater Fish Commission as an endangered species biologist. In 1982, she was hired by the Minnesota DNR as regional non-game wildlife specialist, part of the new non-game wildlife program, and was based in Brainerd. She also taught herpetology at Central Lakes College as an adjunct professor for 10 years. Retiring from the DNR in 2012, she continued volunteer conservation work with the Minnesota Ornithological Union as statewide conservation chair until 2017. She also was active for many years with the Brainerd Lakes Area Audubon Society in the B'nai Council Bird Club, kind of like Pippin Plover. Her current interests and activities include birding, gardening, horseback riding, and hiking. So with that, Pam?
Does that work? Does that work? Okay. When I looked at the program, and well, I was asked, I'm filling in for Carol Henderson. I think many of you know that. And I thought, please don't put me after Bill Berg. Please don't put me on the program after Bill Berg. I've heard Bill speak so many times, and he's so wonderful and so insightful. But he said many things, I was thinking about it as he was going along, that kind of set the stage for what I'm going to say. So I think it's going to work. You talked about diversity. You talk about turkeys. You know, I live here in Brainerd on some acreage. I have more turkeys than grouse right now, running up and down my driveway. Oh yeah. But you talked about a few things, and Carol and his river otters and all that. So what I'm going to talk about today is, it's going to be lighter on science, because I thought Dan and Norm and Doug would all cover a lot of those things. I want to talk more about people and programs and funding and how you get things done and what's changed, what I've seen change over my career. But before I get into it, I do want to give a big thank you to the Minnesota chapter of the Wildlife Society for the 2017 Minnesota Award. That was a big surprise. I'm sorry I wasn't there to accept it when it was given out in February 2018. But thank you. I mean, to have that kind of an award on top of a career is just wonderful. So I just say thank you, thank you, thank you. Very nice. So I need to start talking about Carol, and that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to start with that, and I'll go through a little bit of my career and how I got into this, because I was not your usual wildlife person by any means, and then go through some of what the non-game program did. So first, y'all recognize that guy? And for those of you who are younger and didn't know Carol, this is Carol Henderson as a graduate student in Costa Rica. I mean, he had an unusual beginning. He was at the University of Georgia and ended up going to Costa Rica, doing field work there. And of course, I think many of you know he was supposed to be here. He was supposed to do this talk, but he had unexpected quadruple bypass heart surgery. I had had lunch with him the week before. He was up in the Brainerd area here, and he was still giving loon talks. He's retired. He's still doing it, as many of you know. But so we had lunch together, and the only thing bothering him was his knee, because he needed to get a knee replacement. And he went in for his pre-op checkup, and he flunked. He flunked the stress tests. They ran some more tests, quadruple blockage. He was one lucky man that they found that. So that's Carol when he was young. Most of you know him more looking like this, with his wife Ethel, and they travel a lot in the tropics. Now, Lindsay said, when she asked me to do this talk, to fill in for Carol, she said to send her a photo of a headshot. Now, you've seen that Sgt. Pepper album. I never knew something like that was going to happen. This is the photo I sent them. So they took the headshot, stuck it on there, and when I saw that, I was laughing my head off back there. This is a young me. I showed you a young Carol. So this is a young me when I was back at the University of Florida. I was TAing a class on wildlife ecology. And one of the guys snapped a picture of me. And so I really can't go back 50 years the way Bill did, or more. But I can go back 40 years. This is me 40 years ago. And that's really when my career started in natural resources, when I was in graduate school and then working after that. Before that, though, and I do want to mention this just because Bill talked about the gender thing, diversity and women getting into this field. How did I get into this field? 50 years ago, I was graduating from high school. I had my 50th reunion this year. And when I met with the counselor to say, what kind of career are you going to have? Because I was a good student, I had good grades, I was going to go to college. He gave me 4 choices. You can be a teacher, a nurse, a secretary, or a homemaker. That was it. And I looked at him, and he said, and by the way, from your interest test, you remember they had you take those interest tests? He says, you didn't fit into anything. Well, I knew I didn't fit into any of those. So I went to college. I went to the U of M and started trying different majors. I started out trying to be an elementary ed teacher until I realized I really didn't like kids that much. I really wanted to be outside, and I muddled around for a couple of years, and then my younger brother was going to be graduating from high school, and he said, pick me up some brochures of different things I could go to college for. So I was picking him up things that were traditional male things, engineering, and I don't know, architecture, I don't know what all. One of them I picked up was wildlife management, because they had the program there. And I looked at it and said, this is what I want to do. So I go over to meet the counselor, who is the advisor. You had to go through an advisor. And I said, I want to get into the program. And he said, women don't get jobs in this field. And he just kept shaking his head. This is what I want to do. Well, I got in. I proved my way through that. But that's a true story. That's how I found out about wildlife management, because it was so non-traditional for women. And I guess I was a non-traditional woman. So I graduated. I was one of the first women to graduate as an undergraduate through the Wildlife Management Program, BS. And that was in 1976. Then I went to University of Florida, and that's where I was there. I graduated with my master's. I did do my master's research on deer, which was very traditional. They thought someone from Minnesota knew about deer, and I did. I had looked at a lot of deer. I'd done the check stations. I'd done all that stuff. And the reason but why that's important is because it's about funding. At that time, all the funding was for game species. If you wanted to work on something, you had to get funding on a game species. The Endangered Species Act, which Bill mentioned, 1973 is when that passed. Okay, so I'm down in Florida, 1980, and money is just starting to come into Florida for endangered species. And Florida had a lot of them. Florida had endangered species all over. and they had a lot of population growth and all that. So I got hired as an endangered species biologist. So it's all about money. Where does the money come from? Where are the opportunities if you're going to work in this field? I was down there 2.5 years, and then it was 1982. Now Carol, there we go. That's a little fuzzy, but this is 1982. This is when Carol hired the first Nongame wildlife specialist. And being from Minnesota, of course, I'd been reading about this in the Volunteer, and Carol had been on since 1977, and he'd been on Game and Fish Fund money. Roger Holmes hired him. And so for the first 3 years, he basically had like $25,000 or something. And once the checkoff came on, now Minnesota became the 3rd state to have a non-game checkoff on their state income tax forms. And the first, it was Oregon, Colorado, and then Oregon, and then Minnesota. And that first year that it brought in money, $523,000, which was a huge amount at that time. And so he hired 5 regional specialists. And now, so Carol's on the left, and then there was Joan Galley, and she came from New Jersey with the non-game program in New Jersey. Katie Hawes in the yellow, she came from, it was either Oregon or Washington. She was from the West Coast, working with non-game out there. I had been doing endangered species in Florida. And then in the back, Jack Moody, who came from Minnesota. He was in Grand Rapids doing research. John Schladweiler, who I think most people know from the Southwest, and management. So we had a very mixed, diverse team with a lot of different expertise and a lot of different experiences. Our job, as it was given to us, was to work on about 870 different species. Birds, mammals, fish, reptiles, amphibians, etc. All sorts of things. And we each having different expertise, we could pick some different species that we were going to work on, or there were different initiatives depending what came up. We were supposed to do reintroduction, survey, research, education, habitat acquisition, and promotion. Yeah. People used to ask me, so what do you do for your job? I say, what, you want to know what I do today or tomorrow or whatever, because it was so varied. But in a way, it was wonderful. So much wasn't known about non-game species. And that's another picture of me. This 50-year thing, it got me thinking, going back. This was the first year when I was hired, and Carol sent me out with the staff photographer from the Volunteer and just said, take pictures of her, because what was important was doing promotion, getting the word out to the public. We had to do that. This picture went all over the place because it had the DNR logo. It said we're working on loons, so that everything could be promoted. Reintroduction was one of a couple species. When you're talking about changes over 50 years, we brought back peregrine falcons. Now, the non-game program didn't do it alone. We had many partners. We worked with the University of Minnesota, falconers, and other partners. But peregrine falcons have been very successful, and they're back. We didn't have them 50 years ago. They were gone. There's peregrine falcons nesting under the 371 bypass bridge, which I bet many of you drove over when you came here. They're nesting underneath there, right in Brainerd. And so I see peregrine falcons pretty regularly. The other big reintroduction thing was, of course, trumpeter swans. And I think someone alluded to them being pests, Dan. Yeah. But to others, I know. Yeah, it's like when a farmer said to me once, we were talking about cranes, And he says, yeah, what do they eat? And he was doing specialty melons or something like that in his field. I said, oh, specialty melons is what they, you get too much of anything and they start eating things. But anyways, trumpeter swans are back. I see them all the time now too. And again, we worked with partners. We worked with the Minnesota Zoo. We worked with Carlos Avery. Northwest Airlines helped, Steve Kittleson, who's sitting, back here, worked, a great deal on trumpeter swans. Bald eagles were also mentioned earlier. We did a lot of work on eagles early on, and then they just exploded in numbers. Predators, we've learned, predators do very well, given the right situations. And so we have a lot of eagles now, but in the beginning, I spent a lot of time in small planes, flying eagle surveys, a lot of time writing management plans, all that for eagles. We also did lots of other kinds of wildlife surveys, frogs and toads, waterbirds, colonial waterbirds were big things. But we didn't know about non-game species 50 years ago. Not that much. I mean, it was anecdotal. It was just incidental things and stories. And so our program spent a lot of time collecting information. We also did some land acquisition. Not as much. We weren't specifically for management, but we did areas that were really good for non-game wildlife. We could zero in on and help with acquisition. And we did WMAs and AMAs and conservation easements, all that adding to what we're doing for wildlife. Here was one of mine. Yeah, there's an early photo too of me and Carol. We did bat gates, protecting bat hibernaculums. I think this is Banning State Park. Of course, there was wildlife education. Jan Welsh has been a long time on that for trying to get curriculum in and teaching kids, getting kids outside. How do we do it? Those are all things that we're still struggling with. We helped designate important bird areas, and this was partnering with Minnesota Audubon to highlight areas that were important for birds and trying to give some focus to those areas that these habitats are important. And I worked on these quite a bit. Brian Dirks is here. One of my important bird areas was Camp Ripley. I wrote that at Mille Lacs Lake, big areas. And then sometimes smaller areas like an arboretum. We also worked on wildlife tourism, bird watching opportunities, trying to get people out information about where to go, what to see, trying to bring some of that money into these rural and local areas, getting people out. Now, Carol had a habit of writing books. One of them, Landscaping for Wildlife, but his first one, Woodworking for Wildlife, was wildly popular. And every time Carol wrote a book, all the staff, we kind of got new initiatives we were supposed to do. And so when after Landscaping for Wildlife came out, of course, we were all doing Landscaping for Wildlife. And then there was Lakescaping for Wildlife and Shorelines, and we were all doing shoreline. We would just shift all the time. But again, getting information out to the public, to people, getting them excited about wildlife and the outdoors. Now there's a later picture of me, and later in my career, and it ties into the lakescaping stuff, is that I did a lot of work on shorelines. And in fact, I worked with Paul Radomski a great deal, and I was doing bird surveys out of boats. Spent a lot of time in boats, a lot of time looking at shorelines, trying to identify where the sensitive shorelines were, how can we protect them, how can we maintain our water quality, how can we work with the lake associations, the people that are there. And I do have to say something about loons. Now, I spent a good part of it, we were joking at lunch that, about loons, and they said, they called you the loon lady. I said, yeah, they did, and how once I got a letter addressed, it just said Loon Lady Brainerd, and it got to me. I was pretty well known, apparently, even in the post office. But loons have been a big focus of the Nongame program. And this is Carol with a loon. Well, we were doing a fair amount of work with loons and putting radio tags inside them and geolocators on their legs. And this is one of the nights when Carol was out, we were catching loons. And we worked with the USGS on this. And it was very successful. And one of the things we learned from that work was that the loons go over to Lake Michigan. And they actually, a lot of them come in at the middle of the lake, about halfway down. And then they work their way down to the south end. This is fall migration. And they're feeding there, and then they go down to the Gulf. Now, this also showed us where in the Gulf the loons went. And what was important about that is when there was the BP big oil spill, we knew exactly where our loons were going. We knew what the migration was, and that's why Carol was so successful in getting settlement money, millions or whatever's going to be coming in now for the loons, because that BP oil spill was right in that area. And we knew very much what our loons were doing. And I sigh because, we all have been working on lead for a long time. And lead has been a problem for a long, long time. And originally, I worked on lead tackle exchanges because of my interest with loons in particular, but overall. Worked with Pollution Control Agency to try to get, do these lead tackle exchanges, trying to raise the level, trying to get more non-lead tackle in the sporting goods stores. We just worked and worked and worked at it. I thought, I'm not going to retire until lead gets banned. I gave it up. Which is one of the hard things. And we all know we struggle with some of these issues so much. I retired in 2012. We still aren't even close to, getting lead out of our fishing tackle. But I know some of the BP settlement money is going to go back into tackle exchanges. They're making another run at it. We're working with Nongame staff are going to be working with Pollution Control Agency again on that. So I mentioned earlier, my career was so influenced by where money went. First the Endangered Species Act, and then the Nongame program when that initial money came in. For non-traditional type work, for Nongame work, for endangered species work. And so I have this plate on my car, and I bet pretty much everybody here has a conservation plate. It's another source of funding. Now, Nongame, the donations are matched, by that. It's all about money. How can you get the money? And every talk I used to give when I was working, I had to end the program with this. Because I always reminded people, don't forget to check off, don't forget to make a donation for wildlife. So I had to put it in here. And I have one more image. My lessons learned, and I realized they were the shortest of anybody's, but I'm always summarizing things or making them short. If you notice while I was talking about all the things the Nongame program did, we were always collaborating with other organizations and groups. You had to. We were small. You have to, and you have to find where your interests intersect, and then you just build a coalition or make it work. And so it isn't the easiest way to do things because you don't always agree and you don't always get along, but you do it, you make it work. And I said a couple times during the talk, keep an eye on funding opportunities and new sources of dollars, because that's how you're going to be able to do the natural resources work that you need to do. And last but not least, take risks. Try something new. Carol had a motto, and he trained me. He said it was easier to get forgiveness than permission. I did new things all the time. And some of them didn't work. And then it was like, oh, gee, okay, and I take my licks and then move on. But I learned, try something new. Don't get stuck. And even when the bureaucracy, and I will bet that a lot of the paperwork, the bureaucracy, all those things can just get you down. You just have to sometimes figure out, try something new, take a risk and do it. And I wrote down here a quote from Bill's talk before mine. He said, back in those days, you just did it. Well, Heather Baird, who's here, after I retired, she came to me and said, Pam, how did you do some of these things? They're asking me, the public's asking me to do this and this and this, and I said, I just did it. So sometimes you have to. Didn't I, Heather? I did. Sometimes you can't let the constraints be there if you feel like you're doing the right thing. And we're in this profession because we think this is the right stuff. We think this is the right thing. We love the outdoors. We love wildlife. So I'm just going to finish there and see if you have any questions.
We do have about 15 minutes for questions, so.
Yeah, I planned it for half an hour, and I thought that was as long as anyone wanted to listen to me. So, and otherwise we'll just be ahead of time on the schedule.
A lot of us stay active after retirement. Tell us what you're doing as far as staying active.
Oh, Bill. Well, I just got back from Arizona, hiking in the mountains in southeast Arizona. I'm a bird watcher. I'm a birder. But I'm also still active with my local bird club. The Ornithologists Union just asked me if I would be vice president, and I said no. Not yet. Yeah, I'm staying active. I was in Colombia, South America in February for a couple of weeks. I love to see new places. I love to be outdoors. I love to see the wildlife. When I was in Arizona, I saw coatis, ringtails. Yeah, I see some nods. People have seen these. And of course, javelinas. Yeah. So, saw some good stuff. I'm trying to stay active. Yeah. Dan?
Pam, do you have a sense for the adaptability of loons as far as development and voting activity? I used to think of them as kind of birds of wild and pristine lakes and so on. But it seems to me like in recent years they could really be doing okay in some highly recreational.
Well, and yeah, I've seen that in the Brainerd Lakes area here. I mean, we get a lot of pressure on our lakes. What worries me more is the climate change stuff and how the lakes, when your lakes get warmer and the fish populations start changing. I'm more concerned about that.
As it would affect loons?
Yes, yes, yes,
Affecting their food supply?
yes. Yes, and there's Carol's worked with some initiatives, I have too, with some of the fisheries folks. We're looking at the deep water lakes that are colder, deeper, and Cisco populations. But as lakes warm up and you get into, if the water gets cloudy, loons aren't going to be there. If you get that turbidity in the water, they're sight hunters. And warmer, murkier water is not going to work for them. I guess I worry less about the recreation. I did in the past. And then I kind of thought, you know what, they're adapting. They're smart, they adapt, that sort of thing. But the quality of the habitat is more what I'm concerned about. And we could see the loon range certainly go north.
And do you think as a result of the educational efforts that people are more aware of the loons? It's our state bird, we gotta make sure we stay away from those endemic areas? Is it pride sort of thing?
Sometimes. And then there's idiots. you know, I've been in Brainerd Lakes area here for over 30 years, and I've seen everything out on the water. And I love being on the water. And all it takes is somebody on jet skis, and they're tearing things up. I know I yelled at fishermen. Oh, we like loons. You're too close. The loons are upset. You know, and the people don't always get it. They just don't. They're not as aware. They're so into themselves that they're not watching the wildlife. So, yes.
IUCN has a list of critically endangered species, and you've seen the reports about how our biodiversity is really threatened.
Yeah, yeah.
My question is, do you have a strategic plan for the next endangered species that Minnesota is going to have to deal with?
I don't. I don't know. No, I don't know. That's an interesting talk. I'm retired. That's a good question, though, because you know.
It's more of a collective than you.
Yeah, I know it. I know, and yeah, it just keeps changing, and we have to keep trying to stay one step ahead of everything.
That's why I asked.
That's what your question is. It's asking that. You know, will loons be threatened? You know, they're not right now, but gee, this climate thing is making a lot of changes, and then the population pressure. So, thank you.